Thank you very much, Jack, for that, I think, too long introduction, but very much appreciated. I want to thank Jack, Ken, Ida, Sunny, all the team at ESRA for the invitation and for having me join you this evening. I hope that it will be, as Jack kind of implied, a little bit of a different type of Zoom online video presentation, conversation, discussion, because I think we all are kind of a little bit fed up with these kind of Zoom um, discussions. So I've prepared quite a few slides and a few videos and a few other kind of um, ways to share with you the experience of walking the land of Israel. And of course, with you as a community who are here in Israel, I'm going to make the assumption that many of the places that I've been and that I walked through on Shvil Yisrael, on the Israel Trail, are familiar to you. But I'm certainly delighted to have the opportunity to share with you my experiences. And as you'll see shortly, the discussion is as much about the lessons that I learned while hiking the trail as it is a discussion of actually exploring the land and the people, the geography, the history, culture, and what have you here in the state of Israel. So let's get started. And actually, I want to start with kind of a little bit of a different approach to things. So it's kind of a funny thing to say, to ask you to close your eyes, because here we're on a Zoom and we're supposed to be like looking at each other and looking at the screen. But I want you to imagine for a second, and close your eyes if that helps you. Imagine that you're standing on the side of a cliff and you've got a 50-pound pack on your back. Now, the reason I'm suggesting this is because I want you to imagine me doing that, because this is a real story. I was standing on the side of a cliff with a 50-pound pack on my back, and I was following along the path, and I reached an impasse. Now, I'm on the side of a cliff on a path about this wide. I don't have to exaggerate. And on one side of me is a cliff, and the other side is a fall down also the side of the cliff, a good, say, 20 meters down to the rocks below. And I came to literally a falling off of the path. I couldn't go any further. And I started to panic because I couldn't turn around. My pack on this side was going to bump into the side of the wall, the wall of the cliff. If I turned the other way around, then I was in danger of falling down into the precipice. I really didn't know what to do. I took 3 deep breaths, the way that I would describe it. I looked kind of up and around to try and figure out what I could do because I was frozen. I was feeling trapped. I took these deep breaths, calmed down, focused on what the possibilities were, and I kind of turned very, very carefully, let down my pack to the ground, and I retraced my steps. I found where I had missed the path, as it were. It was supposed to climb up the side of the cliff. And I went back and I picked up my pack, but here's what was really interesting. When I put the pack on, it felt somehow lighter. Now, nothing had changed, obviously, in the pack. Nothing had changed with the pack, but something had changed in me. I had changed. My attitude had changed. And somehow that made it easier to retrace my steps with this 50-pound pack on my back and find my way. And so that's kind of a little bit of a metaphor that I'll come back to shortly. I'm going to share with you my story of hiking the Israel National Trail of Shvil Yisrael. As Jack mentioned, over 1,000 kilometers, 25 kilo, 50-pound pack on my back. I did it all alone over the course of 2 months. And something of a challenge, as I'm sure you know, having walked here or there in the land of Israel, something of a challenge, this 2-month trek of mine for a 50-plus casual hiker. You know, mostly in our country, it's the 21-year-old cohort, not the 51-year-olds who do this kind of a trek. I did about 20 kilometers a day or so, sometimes 30. And alone with my thoughts, I experienced a real transformation. I developed something of a unique perspective on the history of our people, on the history of and our people, and the vistas and the nature of our Holy Land. I was looking to heal, and that's kind of part of my story, because I was out on the trail just 6 weeks after a devastating divorce had turned my life upside down. It's a divorce I hadn't asked for, and I was angry. I was frustrated. I was full of resentment. I was mostly sad and in pain. Meditated on mountaintops. I cried in dry creek beds. I wrote anguished journal entries and composed songs to lift my spirits. I looked back and inward and up to the night sky and over the valley to the next mountain range and down at the ants in the earth, in the dirt, and back along the trail to see how far I'd come. And what I discovered on the Schwiel, on the trail, was a sense of self, a sense of personal and national history, and a perspective of sorts on the human condition. So in my search for inner peace while I was walking the land, I realized many of these truths that really helped me on my personal journey could perhaps be helpful to others. I came to understand that there are 5 fundamental elements which combine to create a framework for real peace and harmony, whether personal or even national, but we're not going to get into the national side, I don't think, today. And the truth is that these things are not new, they're not particularly mysterious, but together for me, as I was healing from my divorce and facing my personal challenge, together they form the basis for that personal healing for me and enabling me to move ahead with my life. Combining these 5 elements on the hiking trail really helps immeasurably in meeting the day-to-day challenge of the hiking, but a life philosophy based on these 5 elements can lead to incredible happiness, the kind that we all yearn for. I mean, that's kind of, like I said, the other subject in my book. Aside from kind of tales of the trail, the whole purpose of writing my book, My Israel Trail, and what I'd like to share with you today are some of the details and anecdotes related to those 5 lessons that I learned while hiking, while trudging through our land of milk and honey. So I'm inviting you to join me as I review these 5 elements and the lessons that I learned while hiking. So let's get started. The first week, basically, in the Eilat Mountains and the Negev Desert, where I'm sure most of you or many of you have visited over the years. This is the kind of vista that you can imagine promotes and produces some incredible moments of just inner contemplation, rumination, or what have you. The quiet of the desert, which we'll talk about more, and the aloneness, not loneliness, but being alone in the desert, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in your own ways, whether it's down south or elsewhere in the Negev or down here in the Eilat Mountains. Well, the truth is, I want to come back to that cliff experience because it really might be a perfect metaphor as we start out, as I start to share with you my journey on the Schwiel. I was at an impasse, and sometimes when you're at an impasse and your next step isn't clear, kind of not sure how we got there, too scared to move ahead. All the alternatives that are imaginable are just bad, dangerous, or frightening, somehow unpalatable. Sometimes you just have to set your baggage down, as I did on the side of that cliff. And sometimes this is true, obviously, not just in the physical side. I'm specifically relating to the emotional side, because times of personal hardship and challenges really test our mettle. Elie Wiesel and Viktor Frankl took the personal and national horror of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and translated their experiences into timeless lessons for humanity. And in Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, he talks a lot about having a goal, having a kind of knowing what your next step is on your journey. And for me, putting down my baggage and evaluating what the possibilities were and what my goal and what my next step was there on the side of the cliff is a great metaphor for an understanding of what I was doing for the entirety of this trek along the Israel Trail. And in terms of goals and Frankl's idea, I mean, look, it's true. I had a goal. Every day I had a goal to get to the night camp safely. Obviously, I had a goal to finish the Schwiel, to finish this hike that I set out with. And I did have a general goal to get my life back on track, or to find a new track for my life after my painful divorce. So kind of that was my idea, setting aside my baggage, reevaluating life, something that I think we all can take to heart when we're meeting our personal challenges. And for me, this 8 week, 48 days of hiking, I didn't hike on Shabbat, day after day, enabled the discovery or the rediscovery of these essential truths for living. And a lot of them are based on Torah, on the Hebrew Bible, on our Jewish tradition, but they're universal, really, and they're relevant for any seekers of truth. I was just overwhelmed with challenges on the trail, in my life, national challenges that we were dealing with in these years. This is about 7, 8 years ago. Every day, I had challenges to face: the heat, very steep inclines, loneliness, crisis of confidence, issues that are happening in my family, news of terror attacks, what have you. I really, really found these lessons incredibly helpful in facing those challenges. But I don't want this just to be talking. I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear, well, the breaths, I guess. I wanted to share with you what it feels like to be on top of a mountain like that in the Negev if you've never been. I want you to experience with me a bit the desert. I guess I go that way. Well, this was something of a perspective, an important perspective. And I'm stopping the sharing for a minute just to be able to see your faces, to interact a little bit more as I continue with my story. There's no question that I had a incredible first experience there in the desert that made all the difference for me and impacted the entire rest of the trip. And that is this feeling in the desert of insignificance, of being irrelevant, literally disappearing from the world and feeling like, I don't matter here. That my problems are at least being put into perspective, that there's a world out there that has their own problems, as it were. I mean, without belittling our pain or our problems, this kind of perspective in the desert that I received, that I discovered, it just makes our problems more manageable. It reduces the intensity when we understand that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. And that was the humility. That was the first lesson that I learned, going back now to sharing with you pictures and videos of the desert. The first lesson that I learned was this sense of modesty. I mean, this humility, which we understand from our Jewish tradition. We connect to Moshe Rabbeinu. We understand from a more modern perspective, Washington or Lincoln or Gandhi, Mother Teresa. The idea of a sense of modesty and humility is almost necessary to reach a certain level of conciliation, a conciliatory kind of, acceptance. We'll talk about as the next lesson I learned. I actually want to jump into that. Some of you may know Har Shlomo, Mount Shlomo, Mount Solomon, right outside of Eilat. Well, I made a mistake. When, in fact, it was really the fault of the writer of the trail guide, the red guide, which is kind of the unofficial trail guide for those of us hiking on Shvil Yisrael, where he said, if you have the time, try and hike to the top of this hill because it's the views are breathtaking. Now, for all of us, since this is a community of people living here in Israel, I can certainly share with you one aspect of this anecdote, which is that the trail guide I read in Hebrew, and I'm fluent in Hebrew. I've lived here for 35 years. But there are some words in Hebrew that even if we consider ourselves fluent, aren't necessarily part of the lexicon or the vocabulary that we might use day to day. So I wasn't really aware. My eyes skimmed over the part in the trail guide where Yaakov Sar, the author of the trail guide, said that this particular tangential kind of hike or a little bit of a leaving the trail to go see this breathtaking view at Mount Shlomo was, as he described it, Tilula Me'od. Aliyah Tilula. And Tilula, for those of you who are not so strong in Hebrew, or the hiking lingo of Hebrew, means steep. exceedingly steep. And I won't go into details. You can read it in the book if you'd like, but I basically got stuck. I was climbing hand over hand up boulders that were literally as big as I am. And I sat down and it was getting dark, and I started to really worry. In fact, I took out my phone. I was going to turn it on and call Tesa, the IDF's rescue service, to come get me up the side of this mountain. And at that point, I kind of learned my second lesson, and that was this question of acceptance. Because I said to myself, Aryeh, you're on the side of a mountain. You are in a situation all alone of your own doing. There's nobody else to blame for it. And being on the side of that mountain, you don't have anybody who's going to get you out of here. Nobody's going to save you. You have to accept where you are. And in accepting it, then make some maybe better decisions, make some good decisions about what your next steps are. And the truth is that acceptance was something for me that made a big difference. That night, I wrote in my journal that it applies, the same idea applies to the situation I found myself in, being divorced, which was something I hadn't anticipated and was not something that I had looked for. I have nothing against, of course, the idea of divorce. Many of us found ourselves in this situation, and there are many marriages that should end in divorce. But it was not something that I had anticipated for myself. And that night I wrote in my journal that, Aryeh, you just have to accept this, just like where you were there on the side of the mountain. This is your situation. And this allows us to focus on what we need to do and almost to enjoy the experience, as it were, to accept what you can't change, to make a good decision to move on. And so for me, that was the second lesson that I learned as I was hiking up the Eilat Mountains, and as I started to move into the middle, to the central Negev, then to Mitzpeh, Ramon, and the Karbolik. That whole issue was something that you could imagine meant a lot to me, and I was contemplating this, reflecting on this as I continued to walk through the desert. I want to invite you to, again, enjoy walking with me. You're welcome afterwards to guess where these places are that you're seeing the videos of. I have enjoyed and continue enjoying both showing these and watching the videos, reminding me of the wind you can hear in the background, but the incredible silence and aloneness, as I mentioned, of being in the desert. But there were other lessons to learn while I was in the desert. Another example, as it were, of this kind of acceptance, of an understanding that, okay, this is where you are and now deal with it. So here's another one that was kind of a little bit frightening. So I took a photo of this. I don't know if you can see it in the shade. I'm assuming you can. This I'm supposed to do the 24 kilo pack. I don't think so. It's just not going to happen. See those two guys down there? We're going to zoom in with this. There's two guys down there. And I asked them when they were about over here on the cliffside, and they were sliding down that part on their bottom, and they have no teak, no tarmeal. I said, is this going to be possible, the 24 kilo pack? You know what their answer was? Their answer was no. Alta says there's a sachanat mavet. They said, no, it's danger of death if you try and come down this very steep incline. with a 25-kilo pack on your back. And so I didn't. So I walked around 3 hours around the mountain there until to get to the night camp. And for me, that was another example of it, that acceptance that I'm referring to. Accepting where you are, accepting what's happening, and making a good decision based on that. And it was true here also on the Karbolet, which is the hardest day, known as the hardest day, hiking Shvil Yisrael, where I literally said to myself, walking along the edge of the cliff. I don't know if you can see, if I can show with my pointer, but there, you literally walk along the top kind of knife's edge of this cliff, with the wind almost blowing the cliff. And I was saying to myself, what am I doing here? I didn't sign up for a challenge hike. I'm just trying to clear my head, as somebody told me a few weeks later, to get over, the pain and suffering that I was enduring. I never signed up for some physical challenge that would be life-threatening, but I got through it by acknowledging the reality of where I am, what I'm doing, stepping very carefully, of course, and that was cathartic. That was a real liberating feeling. And it's an important kind of element that I had within the context of those first few weeks of accepting with this basis of humility, accepting where we are in life. Michael Fox, by the way, who's faced his own challenges, as you may know, Michael J. Fox, the actor, he said once, and I just love this quote, acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is, and that there's just got to be a way through it. And from the perspective of the hike that I was going through, that was an important element of my understanding. That pithy folk aphorism about accepting the things I cannot change, it gets it really right, acknowledging there are specific aspects of life over which we just have no control. Well, it could have been frightening, acknowledging, how small and significant we are in the vast universe in the course of history. But for me, it was, and it is continually just wonderfully comforting, liberating, as I said, and invigorating to accept life as it is. Well, the third lesson I'm going to kind of skip over relatively quickly, because I think it's a little bit more intuitive for all of us, especially those of us living in Israel. And the lesson is gratitude. The understanding of the importance of appreciating the blessings that are in our life. I mean, and that's something that I developed over the course of the hike. It just reinforced in me the gratitude that I have literally for everything, whether it was a sunset or a bird song or a stunning view in the midst of the hike, family or my health, the opportunity that I had to walk the land of Israel, even in the midst of my pain. Sometimes I even cried in thanks for simple things like this, like the first flower that I saw in the desert, or a softer piece of earth to sleep on. I met some amazing people on the trail angels, Malachei Ashvil, which is a unique institution, if you will. It's a unique kind of experience that only the Israel Trail has to offer. No other trek in the world has something like our Malachei Shvil, our trail angels, hosts and friends that I made, people like Aryeh and Leah Schiff, who set up this Bedouin-like tent with an outdoor bathroom in their backyard in memory of their son Ofer, who had been unfortunately killed in a car accident. The gratitude that I had for so many different elements of my life was an incredibly important third lesson that I learned on the trail. And the truth is, I made an incredible connection between the humility and the acceptance and the gratitude that I was feeling in those first 3 weeks. And I actually composed a song here in the Judean desert, where, as you can see in this photo, there's literally nothing to distract you as you walk minute after minute and trudge hour after hour through the desert with, in fact, in this case, no birds, no ants, no shrubbery, almost just rocks and dirt. And it was almost a meditative experience for me. And in fact, in the book, I describe a whole meditative practice that I developed that connected this humility and the acceptance and the gratitude that I've been describing. Well, I just want to move move on because also I'm conscious of the time, and I want to leave time for some questions and answers and discussions at the end. But I want to kind of acknowledge, as I moved from the desert into, this is the Yatir forest, into the northern Negev and then the Jerusalem hills, my appreciation. Here's a little video I took to show what it was like. The appreciation that I had, it was a crucial step on the path to healing, because it just made coping with the suffering and the pain that I was feeling and moving beyond it possible. And for me, moving from the Negev into the Jerusalem hills was itself kind of a transition from acceptance and humility into gratitude, getting nearer my home. I live in Beit Shemesh, which of course is in the foothills of the Jerusalem mountains. And that for me was also a tremendous excitement, not just walking near my home, but this really reinforced what I'd felt in the desert also, but even more so as I came towards Jerusalem, walking in the land of our forefathers, in our ancestral homeland, and having the gratitude to do that as I circumnavigated, as it were, the town of Beit Shemesh, my hometown, where I actually didn't step foot, even though I was literally for an entire week wandering through this area. So I'm jumping through a few of these next slides because the issue that was most resonant for me in walking around Jerusalem was this gratitude, was this appreciation, was this enjoyment and understanding of just how, literally, as Lao Tzu once said, nothing is lacking. And when you realize there's nothing lacking, the whole world, Lao Tzu said, literally opens up to you. I'm stopping to share for a minute. I can see that there's one question. I think it must be Lynn. You're asking for me to explain what the markings are. So there are specific markings on trails in Israel all through the country. And what you can see, a few times I take different pictures of different trail markings. And on the Shvili Yisrael, on the Israel National Trail, there's a specific set of colors that tells you what direction you're going in and that you're on the right trail. And I'll be delighted to share when I have another picture. I'll show you what they meant and what their meaning is. So I'm going to go back and share again some of the pictures of some of my experiences, starting with this very, very fun one, where I spent Purim in a forest right near Beit Shemesh in the hills of Jerusalem, camping out with a friend. Again, real issues of gratitude to friends who came to visit me, including some friends who had recently had a tremendous tragedy, losing their daughter in a car accident, and spending the night by the campfire with them, and my friends who came and read for me the Megillah and celebrated Purim, since I didn't come home, but was near enough to at least connect with some of them. And then moving very quickly ahead, because the time is running out, I jumped up north to areas where some of you also, I'm sure, are very familiar with, the border with Lebanon. I did so because I didn't want to miss the flowering of early spring, but also because this would enable me to then walk south from the border with Lebanon and make my way literally home on foot in the next 4 weeks. So this is halfway through the trip. And I have to kind of stop and share with you an important element of my story, because the gratitude that I've been describing, as you can imagine, wasn't easy in one way to achieve because of my wife's decision to leave. And yet having the humility and the acceptance that I had developed enabled me to appreciate all the wonderful aspects of the life that we built together. And that was very important and part of the process, enabling me to reach what now I want to talk about, the fourth element, which is much less intuitive than the gratitude that I've been talking about. And that is this an issue of forgiveness. And so a little background is, I think, in order. I mean, we had a very happy marriage, my wife and I. And the sudden storm that my wife experienced, which tossed and literally overturned the ship of our marriage and our life, was completely unexpected. And it shocked all of us, our family and our friends. And I supported her right to choose, and I wanted her to be happy. But it was a big shock, a very big shock. And in fact, at the giving of the get, at the giving of the divorce agreement, I literally said to her that I want you to be happy. And if what you want is to end the marriage, then this, I suppose, is the greatest act of love that I can do, to give you that get. But I was devastated. And I think it's important to understand that when talking about forgiveness, because it's definitely been an excruciatingly difficult part, and it was an excruciatingly difficult part of getting over the divorce. So, talking about forgiveness, there's no question that my resentment, my anger, my pain got in the way of me moving on with my life, and it was an important element that I wanted to relate to. That clearly it was an important element that I had to relate to within the context of my healing. So, by the way, as a kind of a little bit of an interruption, since Leah asked, this is the shield sign. This is the sign of the trail, where you have the color of kind of gold brown of the Negev on one side, the color of white or the Hermon in the north on the other side, and the blue for Israel in the middle, which helps to guide you when you're walking on the trail. Well, so I was saying that the anger and the resentment and the pain that I had, anger at my wife, the way she left me, but also at God for allowing this pain and suffering to happen, anger at myself for mistakes that I'd made, even if not knowing, in my life and in our relationship. All these things got in the way of my healing and moving on with my life and enjoying life. And I had a very, very poignant, I would say, transformative experience here at Nachal Snir, which some of you may recognize, which was a place that I went with my family and our 3 children many, many times in the early years of our family life. And I decided when I was walking by here that I just had to jump in the water. And so I did. And in jumping in the water, something almost magical happened. It was like Mayim Chayim. It was like a mikveh experience where jumping in the water, I had this cleansing experience, and I came out of the water, and it takes much longer to tell than when it actually happened. I came out of the water crying. I'm the kind of a guy who cries. I'm embarrassed to admit. And I came out of the water crying, and the water was mixing with my tears, and I felt literally reborn from this Mayim Chaim. And why was that? Because I had this tremendous feeling of forgiveness. I realized I finally forgave my former wife. I mean, I had intellectually forgiven her. I mentioned that. I had acknowledged her right to make her decision. But this was an emotional forgiveness that I achieved there in the waters of Nachal Snir, which was not so different than the experiences in the desert, in the quiet of the desert, just incredibly liberating and freeing and enabling me to really think towards the future. You may be familiar with Leo Buscaglia, a very famous teacher at UCLA for many years, who I studied his books when I was studying psychology at UC Berkeley. He used to talk and writes a lot about the issue of forgiveness, forgiving our parents, for instance, for doing, as best as they could, for being human. We have to forgive our parents. He passionately advocates moving on and exploring all the alternative paths that are available to us in any situation, whether it's forgiving our parents or our spouse or God or ourselves or anything else. And Gandhi actually wrote and spoke very similarly. Now, obviously, it's not necessary to forgive and forget, but even if we forgive and remember, it's important to forgive in order to put behind us whatever the historical grievances that we have. And that's true in terms of trying to reach inner peace And it's also true in terms of trying to reach international peace, peace with our neighbors. Why am I mentioning that? Well, you can hear this peaceful, well, there's a lot of wind. This is a very peaceful, quiet um, location on the border with Lebanon in the Baram forest, which you may also be familiar with. And so the reason I'm connecting it between inner peace and international peace is because I spent a lot of time thinking, I write about this a bit in the book also, I spent a lot of time thinking on the border with, hiking on the border with Lebanon about the issue of our peace with our neighbors, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, etc. That's probably going to be the subject of my next book, putting aside our historical grievances nationally to reach peace with our neighbors. But I'm not going to go into that now. Even I'm not going to go much more deeply into that in terms of our inner peace struggles, because I do want to wrap up in a few minutes. So I want to tell a few interesting anecdotes from the north of the country, because one of the things I haven't touched on really in the discussion until now is the difference between hiking in Israel, as I'm sure you all know, and hiking in any other trek or hiking area, the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail or Machu Picchu or Nepal or any other hikes that people take, like Yosemite, which is where I grew up hiking in California. And that is, of course, our connection to our ancestral homeland, to our people, to our history. And I don't have a picture here of it, but I remember so well stumbling on a small burial spot, a tomb, in the forest of Baram, or near the Baram forest on the border with Lebanon, and discovering that this was the tomb of Yeshayahu ben. I had to look it up because I didn't know the name, and I didn't realize that, yes, that's Yeshayahu. That is Isaiah the prophet, the famous one, the swords and plowshares one, and that this was apparently his tomb that I just stumbled across in a forest without any real fanfare, with no road leading up to it as a pilgrimage spot or what have you. That doesn't happen elsewhere, in hikes elsewhere in the world. And that kind of a connection, here's a picture of a gut, of a wine press. And as Jack mentioned, I make wine. And coming across an ancient wine press as I wandered the land of Israel was something for me that was a phenomenal part of the experience of hiking the Shvil. I'm going to jump just quickly through because I want to finish up. So I'm going to jump very, very quickly through the last 2 weeks of the trail, because the most important element, I'm going to stop the sharing. You remember that cliff that I started with? That's this cliff here. And you can see as it wanders off, then it just stops there at the edge, but there's some handrails on the left. That's the part that I had missed when I described it in the very beginning, that I was supposed to, and they did in the end, climbing up there on the left. So I'm stopping the screen share because I just want to talk for another few seconds about some of the elements that led us to the end of the trail, and then I'll end with a last few slides just for fun, and then I'll open it to your questions if you have any specific issues that you want me to explore, either about the lessons learned or the hike itself, or some of the other challenges that I faced. Towards the end, as I reached the sea, I started to think about the future, about what's going to happen now that I'm going to finish the trail in another few days. What's going to be next? I had some thoughts about personal goals, professional goals, finding new challenges to pursue in terms of my career and some of my public work on behalf of Israel. The truth is, though, at this point, I was kind of putting into place one of these elements that I mentioned at the very, very beginning, of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, talking about having a sense of purpose, having a sense of goals and objectives within the context of our lives. And there's no question that I was able to commit or recommit my personal and national sense of mission and meaning in being part of this return to Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel after 2,000 years of dispersion. That was very much part of the experience of hiking the Israel Trail. And so as I started to near home, as I started to wind my way from Tel Aviv back to Beit Shemesh, I was thinking about all sorts of different things that were part of my life and where I wanted to go, opening a winery, joining my friend Yosef to promote renewable energy in Africa, being more involved in promoting Israel and reasserting the legitimacy of Israel and the legitimacy, obviously, of our founding and our right to defend ourselves, etc. And it made for me a very, very important part of the trail experience, having an understanding of what I was going to do next, because I was about to finish hiking the trail, and I needed to have some idea of, okay, where am I going next? And those last few days, I'm now sharing the screen of where I spent my last night, is where I really kind of put all the pieces together of all these lessons that I learned, that at base, taken to heart, an individual with a sense of humility, with a humble sense of purpose, has a greater motivation to forgive, more to appreciate, to be grateful for, and a greater incentive to accept the historical and present reality, basically because he or she just wants to move forward with their life. And from my perspective, finishing the 1,000 kilometers of the Shvil was very much that for me. It was true for me on the Shvil. It's true for me in my life, actually, and it can be true for others that are seeking solace or direction. And that's kind of why I wrote the book, to describe my experiences on the Shvil, how they help me face my personal challenges, how they can help others facing their hardships. I'm convinced these 5 elements can be the foundation of real reconciliation also between here in the Middle East, between us and our neighbors. But as I said, that's kind of the topic of my next book. But I kind of wrote the book to tie all these pieces together and to enable all of us to be able to face our challenges with those tools of humility and acceptance, gratitude and forgiveness, and a sense of purpose. And that's kind of the end of my story, and the end of my telling of my story, and the end of my journey, at least for now. And here's a look at how I actually arrived home that day, 8 weeks after I'd set out at my home in Beit Shemesh. This is my daughter-in-law, who joined me with my son on the last few miles.
Hey, she's coming. Hey, no, wait, I'm coming around, wait. Dad, you have to run through, wait.
So that was how we ended it. And so, what can I say? After the Shvil, I quit my job. I found new goals. I found new love too. My caring and wise and patient, loving, beautiful, wonderful, understanding wife, Miriam. I wrote my book. I'm working towards opening my winery, and I certainly have made great strides to to reaching some greater sense of inner peace. The truth is that through my experiences on the Shvil, physically, and then the processes of the inner outer exploration and personal growth during and after the trek, I discovered a path which I'm confident can be of enormous help to others facing similar challenges and decisions, based as it is on how do we unmute? Oh my God.
Okay, we can hear you.
You can hear me, okay, because it said I was muted. I was just summing up, just to say that what I discovered, this path was based on time-honored wisdom, the works of giants, from Talmudic sages to modern psychologists and teachers and writers. Sometimes we just have to set aside our baggage and reevaluate where we are. And that's all I wanted to say. This idea of humility and acceptance and gratitude, which is led to forgiveness and a sense of purpose, they all found a home in me. And the truth is, you don't have to hike 1,000 kilometers in 8 weeks with a 25 kilo, 50-pound pack on your back all alone in order to do that. It's obviously worth considering. And so, I would happily recommend that all of you consider going on at least a day or an hour on Shvil Yisrael. It's definitely the kind of thing that I would recommend at whatever age. It obviously was something that has added tremendously to my life. So I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to answer your questions. Or I see there's a few things on the chat, so I can answer a few of the questions. I think Jack.
All right, Aryeh, I do not see questions on the chat. Perhaps you do. Do you?
Yeah, there. I see a few direct messages, so I'll just answer a few of them quickly. One question was, is the trail well marked and easy to keep the trail? Yes, although as I note in my book, I probably lost the trail like I described in that first anecdote, probably 2, 3, 4 times a day. You lose the trail, and then you have to retrace your steps, maybe for a minute, maybe for a half an hour, but it's relatively well marked. I appreciate the note from Belinda. Belinda, you should have written this to everyone, not just to me, but I'm going to read it just because I can. You wrote, I found your book extremely inspirational. Thank you for saying so. And I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. Somebody writes, did you ever have any concerns about security or feel in danger along the trail? And I appreciate the question. I get asked that a lot. And the answer is really no. First of all, I'm a man, and unfortunately in our society, I think women feel less secure on their own, perhaps especially camping out at night. But the truth is, there's never been any report of any physical aggression on Shvil Yisrael. There have been acts of theft, so you want to keep your valuables with you, but either from people or animals, physical safety was never a real concern of mine.
Okay, we have a question here from David Aziz.
Sure.
How did you prepare for the hike? 0 to 25 kilometers a day is a big jump.
Yes, that's very true. And the answer is that I had a few different kinds of preparations. I didn't really mention at the beginning, but I did a lot of hiking, both growing up and in college, and then also here in Israel with my kids. All of you live in Israel, you're familiar with Tiyul Shnati, which all of our kids or grandkids enjoy. And I used to do at least 3, if not 6 of those a year, and a lot of hiking with my kids too. So I was in pretty good shape. I'm a biker. I go out on my bike for a few hours, at least 2, 3 times a week back then. I basically put 50 pounds, 25 kilos of rocks in a bag and hiked around Beit Shemesh for 20 kilometers to make sure that I was being realistic and that the red guide was realistic and I could achieve that. And I had a friend, child of friends, who's also a friend of mine, come over and help me with the packing at one point before hiking. And of course, then the other sort of preparation was arranging for food to be buried in various places or to be delivered, water resources to be available, especially, of course, there in the south. One of the questions here is, how did you come to decide to walk on the trail rather than something else? Susan, thank you for the question. I had always wanted to hike the Israel Trail. As I mentioned, I have friends and children of friends and friends of my children who had hiked the trail. I'd even joined them once or twice here or there on the trail for a day. Done a lot of hiking here in Israel, and it kind of for years thought, one day I want to do that. And when the divorce was imminent, just a few months before it actually came through, my daughter, Moriah, finished her army service. We went on a trip to Barcelona and then to California together and visited my folks there. We went to Yosemite, which I just mentioned. I was very familiar with, used to hike a lot. Went to summer camp there as a child growing up in California. And my daughter and I hiked up a very, very difficult mountain called Half Dome, a granite cliff, which was psychologically and physically and emotionally probably the most difficult thing I've ever done. And we got to the top of it. We made it. And I turned to Moriah, my daughter, and I said, you know what? This is giving me cheshek, which of course you understand means giving me the desire to hike the Israel Trail. I'm going to do that. And this was just a few months before the divorce came through. So by the time I was home here and preparing to give my former wife the get, I started to prepare both in terms of the preparations I just described, working out with my employer, being able to take a leave of absence. And so literally just a few weeks after handing her the get, the bill of divorce, I was out there on the hike. Who took the photos?
We have a comment here, not a question, from Fonda Dove. I feel the same humility and gratitude and blessed to live in a lot facing the Mount Shlomo Mountains with their ever-changing colors. Every morning I'm standing at my window looking out at them, taking a few deep breaths and experiencing gratitude. Then we have a question from Mira Brown. Who took the photos and how did you access food?
All the photos were taken by me. And the one or two that you saw of me were putting my digital camera on a rock and letting it film me, either video or a photo or a selfie. And the food and the water issues were, I basically set up, I had a schedule that I tried to keep to. I was resupplied either by one of my kids who came, for instance, down to the Negev and met me for Shabbat, or I found stores along the way. There are a number of places, as I mentioned, where I buried water or I had water waiting for me by a desert tour company, because there are certain parts in the Negev where you're hiking for 2 or 3 days without access. And I carried my food with me. I'm a vegetarian. I had a lot of oatmeal, granola bars, quinoa, and hardy vegetables like celery and carrots or what have you with me. And then I resupplied every few days because, you live here. It's a small country. Even in the Negev, you might have to hike for an hour or two out of your way to get to the nearest road or store or yeshuv community. But between that and burying things along the way and being supplied by the desert tour company, I managed it.
Okay, I have a reminder here from Glennis Birdfield saying that ESRA has monthly hikes, and we have hiked many parts of the Israel Trail hikes. Her hikes are actually led by her husband, Lawrence. A question from Lynn Ross. What months did you hike?
I set out in mid-February, about 2 weeks before the official season starts. I hiked from the south, February 15th till March 15th or so. And then, as I said, jumped up north and hiked down from the north to the south from mid-March to mid-April. And that's pretty standard. Most people in the late winter, early spring start in the south and go north. And the other option is to start in the mid-fall, late fall, starting in the north and moving south. Susie Katz asks, was the transition back to normal life after the hike difficult? You can't imagine, and your question kind of presupposes that you can imagine. Yes, it was very difficult. In fact, I skipped through a number of the slides that I had prepared because I didn't feel that we had enough time. One of which was a few friends who took me out for dinner in the Jerusalem Hills in Ein Kerem. Back in the day before Corona, when you actually could go to a restaurant and sit around a table, and the slide itself that shows us sitting around the table, I won't pull it up now, but it was such a surreal experience. These people were having a night out at a restaurant, having dinner, part of their normal lives, and here I was in the midst of this journey, both physical and emotional and psychological, and I was surrounded by friends and feeling entirely alone. And the transition took quite a few weeks when I got home to kind of get back into some sense of normal life. But I will say that these lessons were so very helpful because the acceptance that I had reached, and the forgiveness that I had reached, and the goals that I had set for myself in that last week as I winded my way along the Yarkon River from Tel Aviv and then south coming home to Beit Shemesh, really kind of galvanized the next steps in my life and helped me to focus on what it is that I wanted to achieve in terms of coming back into the kind of normalcy of life. Because I mean, your question also is very relevant because, of course, having reached all of these wonderful understandings, I was still alone. I came back to a house where I was alone, where I was divorced, where no kids living at home and no wife, and yet the lessons that I learned in the course of the hike really made that something obviously not just much more bearable, but enabled me to look beyond that and to move on with the new steps in my life.
Okay, that's it for the questions. Aryeh, I want to tell you, I think I can speak for most of the people here. This has been one of the most spiritual talks I've ever had. I've ever had the pleasure to listen to. I actually learned quite a bit. I want to thank you for your talk this evening. I also want to give a thank you to Gabrielle for helping put this together on behalf of ESRA Technical. And thank you very much. Thank you, and have a good evening and a safe Seger to everybody. And we should get out soon. And for those who are interested, Shana Tova. There you go. Thank you very much.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Jack. Thank you for hosting. And of course, if anybody's interested, you can contact me directly if you'd like. I'm happy to sign a book and send it to you, or you can get it on with Stamatsky's or Amazon or what have you. Thank you all very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.